The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Sterling Financial smelled like old money and fresh fear. 12 faces turned toward the head of the table where Robert Harrison stood, silver hair perfectly combed, navy suit pressed sharp enough to cut glass. The projector behind him displayed a single number in red, $47 million. His voice carried the weight of 20 years at this company. 2 decades of trust that made what came next feel inevitable. Ladies and gentlemen, I take no pleasure in this presentation, but the evidence is irrefutable. He clicked the remote. Wire transfer receipts filled the screen, each one bearing the same digital signature at the bottom. Catherine Sterling, Chief Executive Officer. Over 18 months, our CEO has systematically embezzled company funds through shell corporations in Dublin, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands. Each transaction authorized during her business trips designed to avoid detection. Catherine Sterling sat at the opposite end of the table, spine rigid in her charcoal Max Mara suit, hands folded to hide the trembling. At 36, she'd spent 5 years proving she deserved the CEO chair her father left her. 5 years fighting the whispers that she was just a legacy appointment. Now those whispers had found their proof. Thomas Miller, the eldest board member at 68, leaned forward. His family had invested in Sterling Financial before Catherine was born. Robert, these are serious allegations. Has legal reviewed? Our outside counsel received the preliminary findings yesterday. They recommend immediate suspension pending a SEC investigation. The door at the far end of the boardroom swung open. A figure in navy coveralls pushed a janitor's cart through, the wheels squeaking against polished marble. The room fell silent, irritation rippling across expensive faces at the interruption. The janitor was tall, black, broad-shouldered beneath the shapeless uniform. He moved with the particular invisibility that comes from years of being looked through rather than at. The board members' eyes slid past him, already dismissing his presence as they returned to Harrison's presentation. But the janitor didn't leave. Instead, he stopped the cart in the center of the room, directly between Harrison's projection and the board's sight line. His hands moved to the front of his coveralls, finding the zipper. A security guard stepped forward. "Sir, this is a private—" The coveralls fell away. Beneath them, a charcoal suit, off the rack but pressed with care, a white shirt, a burgundy tie. The janitor's badge clattered to the floor. James Cooper straightened to his full height, 6'2" of controlled purpose, and reached into the cart for a leather briefcase worn soft at the corners. Harrison's face drained of color so fast it looked like someone had pulled a plug. James's voice came out steady, each word measured like he'd been saving them for years. "My name is James Cooper. I'm a certified forensic accountant with 15 years of experience in financial fraud investigation." He set the briefcase on the conference table with a soft thump that somehow commanded more attention than any gavel. "I have 287 pages of evidence proving that Robert Harrison has embezzled $186 million over 30 years. Framed 8 innocent people to cover his tracks, and is responsible for the death of FBI Special Agent Margaret Cooper." The silence that followed felt like falling. James opened the briefcase, the click of the latches sharp in the stillness. Inside, neatly tabbed folders, each one color-coded, each one representing months of work that nobody in this room could begin to imagine. 8 years ago, my wife died investigating Mr. Harrison. Her car went off a cliff on Route 7 in Connecticut. Brake failure, they said. Single vehicle accident. He pulled out a photograph, slid it across the table. Margaret Cooper in her FBI windbreaker, dark eyes warm with the kind of intelligence that saw through lies like they were written on glass. 3 weeks before she died, she had 237 pages of evidence linking Mr. Harrison to a massive embezzlement scheme at Harrison Holdings in Cleveland, evidence that disappeared the day after her funeral. Robert Harrison found his voice, but it came out higher than usual, tight, with something that might have been panic. "This is absurd. Security, remove this man immediately." James didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. I took a job as a janitor in this building 3 months ago. Worked the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., cleaning executive floors. You walked past me 46 times, Mr. Harrison, stepped over my mop bucket, told me I missed a spot. You never once looked at my face. He turned to the board, meeting each set of eyes in turn. For 3 months, I've listened, documented, gathered evidence, and what I found goes back 3 decades. Mr. Harrison has been doing this since 1994. 8 victims, always people of color, always framed with the same shell company structure, always when internal audits got too close. Catherine's hands had stopped shaking. She stared at James like he'd appeared from another dimension, which in a way he had. The invisible made visible, the dismissed made essential. Thomas Miller's voice cut through the tension. Mr. Cooper, these are extraordinary claims. Do you have evidence to support? I have server logs showing Mr. Harrison accessed Miss Sterling's digital credentials from his home terminal at 2:17 a.m. on October 3rd. I have incorporation documents proving the shell companies used to steal $47 million were registered to him in 1998, 22 years before Miss Sterling became CEO. I have HR complaint files from 6 previous victims, all buried by company policy, all following the same pattern. Elizabeth Brooks, 55 and sharp as broken glass, interrupted. How did you obtain these files? If you accessed company servers without authorization, I obtained them the same way I obtained access to this building every night for 3 months. I became invisible. I pushed a cart and carried a mop, and you all forgot I was human. The words landed like stones in still water, ripples spreading outward. James reached into his briefcase again, pulled out a small digital recorder. On December 8th, at 2:43 a.m., I was cleaning the floor outside Mr. Harrison's office when he made a phone call. The conversation was not encrypted. I recorded it. He pressed play. Harrison's voice, tinny through the small speaker but unmistakable. Catherine's getting too curious about the Dublin accounts. We need to move up the timeline. Frame her before she requests an external audit. Another voice, older, unfamiliar. Like the Thompson woman in 2016? Exactly. Break failure worked then. Framing works now. Cleaner this way. Less mess. The recording clicked off. 9 months earlier, Catherine Sterling had discovered she was about to lose everything. The discovery came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, alone in her corner office while the rest of Manhattan slept. She'd been reviewing quarterly reports, a glass of 18-year Macallan sweating condensation onto her desk, when the numbers stopped making sense. A wire transfer of $8.2 million to Dublin Holdings, LLC. She'd never heard of Dublin Holdings. Her digital signature sat at the bottom of the authorization form like an accusation. She'd pulled up the company database, fingers moving faster as something cold settled in her chest. 16 more transfers over 18 months. Always to shell companies she didn't recognize. Always when she'd been traveling, out of the office, unreachable for verification. Total, $47 million gone. Her digital credentials used to authorize theft from her own company. The whiskey had gone warm before she moved again. Her hands found her phone, pulled up a search. Forensic accountant, financial fraud, New York City. The top result, Cooper and Associates. One-man operation, small office in Brooklyn. Reviews mentioned integrity, attention to detail, willingness to take cases the big firms wouldn't touch. One review stood out. James helped my small business recover from employee theft when everyone else said it wasn't worth the fees. He cares about justice, not just billable hours. She'd left a voicemail at 12:30 a.m., voice steadier than she felt. Mr. Cooper, my name is Catherine Sterling. I'm CEO of Sterling Financial Group. I have a very sensitive situation. Someone is framing me for embezzlement. I need your expertise. Please call me back. This is urgent. Then she'd sat in her office until dawn broke over the East River, trying to understand how the company her father built, The legacy he'd entrusted to her had become a trap designed to destroy her. James Cooper had listened to that voicemail 3 times before calling back. He'd been standing in his kitchen in Bedford-Stuyvesant, making breakfast for his daughter while trying to figure out how to pay rent. The brownstone had belonged to Margaret's grandmother, left to them in a will that felt like the only inheritance that mattered. But the property taxes kept climbing, and forensic accounting paid better than janitorial work, but not by enough to feel secure. The number on the voicemail was a Manhattan area code, the kind that usually meant corporate law firms who'd waste his time with preliminary interviews before hiring a white-owned competitor. But Catherine Sterling's voice had carried something he recognized. The particular desperation of someone watching their world collapse in real time. He'd called back at 9 a.m., professional and careful. "Miss Sterling, this is James Cooper returning your call." Relief had flooded through the phone line. "Mr. Cooper, thank you. Can we meet? Today if possible. I have an opening at 2 p.m., my office in Brooklyn." A pause, so brief he almost missed it. Catherine Sterling had probably never been to Brooklyn for a business meeting in her life. But desperation erases geography. "I'll be there." She'd arrived in a Mercedes S-Class with a driver who kept the engine running, stepping onto the sidewalk in front of James's building like she was visiting a foreign country, which in a way she was. The office occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse wedged between a bodega and a laundromat. No doorman, no marble lobby, just a glass door with his name stenciled in black letters, and a bell that chimed when she pushed through. James had watched her take in the waiting room. 4 chairs, old but clean industry magazines on a coffee table with water rings, walls painted eggshell white because it was cheapest. His receptionist position sat empty because he couldn't afford to hire one. She'd worn her armor, $4,000 coat, Hermes bag, heels that cost more than his monthly grocery budget. He'd stood in the doorway of his inner office watching her catalog his limitations before she even looked at him. Tall, black, in an off-the-rack suit that fit well enough but would never be mistaken for bespoke. No diplomas on the wall, though he had the credentials. No art, no bookshelf full of leather-bound law volumes for show. Just a desk, 2 chairs, a computer, and filing cabinets full of other people's financial disasters. "Miss Sterling, please come in." She'd followed him inside, sat in the chair he indicated. Up close, he could see the exhaustion beneath her makeup, the particular weariness that comes from not sleeping while your mind plays out worst-case scenarios on repeat. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. You said someone is framing you for embezzlement. Tell me everything." So she had. The discovery at 11:47 p.m., $47 million. Shell companies she'd never heard of. Her digital signature on documents she'd never signed. The mounting certainty that someone she trusted had decided she was expendable. James had taken notes, asked specific questions about access protocols and authorization procedures, but part of his mind was already running a different calculation. He'd spent 8 years tracking Robert Harrison across 4 states, losing the trail in 2021 when Harrison had gone quiet for 6 months. James had assumed retirement or maybe just better operational security. Then 2 weeks ago, routine background research had revealed that Robert Harrison was now CFO of Sterling Financial Group in Manhattan. James had applied for a janitorial position that same day. Now Catherine Sterling sat in his office describing an embezzlement scheme that matched Margaret's last investigation so precisely it felt like reading a signature. "Miss Sterling, the shell companies you mentioned, Dublin Holdings, Singapore Financial Services, Cayman Trust, can you access the incorporation documents? I can request them from our legal department, but that might alert. Don't go through official channels. Do you have direct access to the company database?" "As CEO, yes, but pull up the corporate registration records. Look for the beneficial owner on the Dublin Holdings filing." She'd pulled out her phone, logged into the system with credentials that might already be flagged for termination. Her fingers moved across the screen, color draining from her face as she read. The beneficial owner is listed as RWH Holdings, a private entity controlled by... She looked up, meeting James's eyes. Robert Harrison. James had kept his face neutral, but inside, something that had been wound tight for 8 years finally clicked into place like a lock accepting its key. Robert has been CFO for 20 years, my father's closest advisor. He walked me down the aisle when I got married because my father was too sick. He was at my father's bedside when he died. And now he's framing you for crimes he committed. The words sat between them, too large for the small office. Catherine's voice came out smaller than before, stripped of executive authority. Why? I trusted him. I've never questioned his judgment, never interfered with his work. Why would he? Because you started asking questions. Even if you didn't realize what they meant. James pulled up a file on his computer, turned the monitor so she could see. A timeline, color-coded, spanning 3 decades. Robert Harrison has done this 8 times before. Same pattern. Embezzles over several years, and when internal audits get close, he frames someone else. Always someone without the resources to fight back effectively. Always someone whose testimony will be dismissed. He pointed to an entry from 2016. Margaret Cooper, FBI Special Agent. She was investigating Harrison Holdings in Cleveland. 3 weeks before she was scheduled to present evidence to a grand jury, her car went off a cliff. Brake failure. The investigation was closed. Evidence disappeared. Catherine's hand had gone to her mouth. Margaret Cooper was my wife. The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of something bottomless. I've been tracking Harrison for 8 years. Across Cleveland, Chicago, Boston. He's careful, always moving before anyone can build a complete case. But he uses the same shell company structure every time. The same routing through Dublin, Singapore, the Caymans. It's elegant, really. And it's how I knew. Catherine had found her voice again, though it came out different than before. Less polished, more raw. When I called you, you already knew about Robert. I knew he was CFO at Sterling Financial. I didn't know he was framing you specifically until you told me about the digital signature forgery. And the janitor job? James had allowed himself a small, grim smile. I needed access to executive floors after hours. Security is lighter at night and people don't question a man with a mop bucket. I've been documenting his movements, his communications, building a timeline of the current fraud. You calling me was coincidence. Or fate. I don't believe in fate, but I believe in patterns, and Robert Harrison follows a pattern so precise you could set your watch by it. Catherine had leaned back in her chair, something shifting in her posture. The armor of her expensive clothes suddenly looked less like confidence and more like costume. What do? We need to access the original server logs, the ones that show when and where your digital credentials were compromised. Your CFO will have buried them, but they exist. Server backups are legally required to be maintained for 7 years. We need the physical servers in your building, the ones that haven't been scrubbed yet. I can authorize access. I'm still CEO. You said your executive access was suspended pending the board investigation. They suspended my ability to execute financial transactions. They didn't revoke my physical security clearances, not yet. James had studied her face, seeing the calculation happening behind her eyes. Catherine Sterling had spent 5 years in the corner office. 5 years learning to navigate corporate politics and board dynamics. She knew the difference between official suspension and actual powerlessness. The servers are in basement level 2. Climate-controlled biometric security, I have access. Then that's where we start. But Miss Sterling, if we do this, there's no going back. The board will see it as destroying evidence or corporate espionage. If we're caught, you lose whatever plausible deniability you have left. She'd met his eyes without flinching. My plausible deniability is already gone. Robert made sure of that when he forged my signature 47 times. The only question now is whether I go down for his crimes or whether we expose the truth. The truth doesn't always win. No. But it's the only option that lets me sleep at night. James had recognized the look on her face. He'd worn it himself 8 years ago, standing at Margaret's grave, choosing between safe grief and dangerous justice. We go tonight, 11 p.m. Security rotation changes at 11:15, gives us a 15-minute window when shift handoff creates coverage gaps. Wear dark clothes, nothing memorable. And Miss Sterling? Yes? You'll need to leave your phone at home. They're tracking it. That had been 3 days ago. Now James stood in the kitchen of his brownstone at 6 a.m., making breakfast for Sarah while his mind ran through the plan for the 100th time. The kitchen smelled like pancakes and the particular kind of anxiety that tastes like copper in the back of your throat. Sarah Cooper sat at the small table, 9 years old, with her mother's eyes and her mother's gap-toothed smile when she remembered to smile at all. Lately she'd been quiet, watchful in ways that made James's chest hurt. "Daddy, you're making them too brown." He looked down at the griddle. The pancakes had gone from golden to bronze while his attention wandered. "You're right, baby. Sorry, I'll make fresh ones." "It's okay. I like them crispy." She said it with the particular generosity of children who've learned to make peace with their parents' distraction. James scraped the pancakes onto her plate, added butter and syrup, sat down across from her with coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. "How's school?" "Fine. Just fine." Sarah pushed syrup around her plate with the edge of her fork. "Richard Jr. said you cleaned toilets at his dad's office." The coffee cup stopped halfway to James's mouth. "Richard Jr.? Is his father Robert Harrison?" "I don't know. Richard's in 5th grade. He said his dad works at a big company and makes real money, not like you." The words landed with the casual cruelty of playground hierarchy. But beneath them, James heard the question Sarah was too young to articulate. "Are we poor? Are you ashamed of what you do? Should I be ashamed?" He set the coffee down, took a breath that was supposed to center him but just highlighted how off-center he'd been for years. "Sarah, look at me." She did, those dark eyes so much like Margaret's that sometimes it hurt to meet them. "There is no shame in any honest work. I do clean buildings sometimes. I also analyze financial records and help people who've been stolen from. Both jobs matter. Both jobs have dignity." But Richard said, "Richard is wrong. And his father is someone I need to tell you about, but not yet. Not until this is over. Until what's over?" "How do you explain to a 9-year-old that you've spent 8 years hunting the man who killed her mother? That you've worked 2 jobs and missed bedtimes and school plays? Because you were building a case that might finally deliver something that looked like justice? There's something important I need to finish, something that has to do with Mom. And when it's done, I promise I'll explain everything. But right now, I need you to know that no matter what anyone says, you come from people who fight for what's right. Your mom did. I'm trying to. And someday when you're ready, you'll understand what that means." Sarah had returned to her pancakes, but something had shifted in her posture. Less defeated, more thoughtful. "Mrs. Patterson at school says revenge is wrong. She says we should forgive people." "Mrs. Patterson is right about forgiveness, but this isn't revenge, baby. This is justice. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" James had thought about this question for 8 years, turned it over in his mind during night shifts and early mornings. Tested different answers that all fell short. Revenge is about making yourself feel better by hurting someone who hurt you. Justice is about making sure they can't hurt anyone else. "Oh." She'd gone back to eating, and James had let the conversation end there because some truths were too heavy for 9-year-olds to carry, and he'd already given her too many. After Sarah left for school, James had returned to his laptop, reviewing the plan one more time. Catherine would meet him at the loading dock entrance on 47th Street at 11 p.m. They'd use her credentials to access basement level 2 through the freight elevator. Server room required biometric scan, but Catherine's fingerprints were in the system. Copy the logs to 2 USB drives, 8 minutes maximum. Exit the same way. Simple, direct, probably legal since Catherine technically still had authorization even if the board thought otherwise. The part that made his palms sweat wasn't the break-in. It was what came after. Once they had the evidence, once they could prove Harrison had forged Catherine's credentials, they'd have to present it to the board, and that meant revealing who James really was. The janitor who wasn't a janitor. The grieving husband who'd spent 8 years building a case. The man who'd been invisible by choice, watching and waiting for the moment when invisibility became the ultimate advantage. Robert Harrison had walked past him 46 times in 3 months. Had complained about James's work, criticized his technique, treated him like a piece of furniture that occasionally needed to be moved. Never once had Harrison looked at James's face long enough to recognize the man whose wife he'd killed. That was going to change tonight. James's phone buzzed. Catherine, from a burner number he'd given her. "We're still on for tonight?" "Yes, 11 p.m. loading dock." "I've been thinking about what you said, about there being no going back. Having second thoughts?" A pause that stretched long enough for James to wonder if she'd hung up. "No, but I wanted to tell you something. When my father was dying, he made me promise to trust Robert above everyone else. Said Robert had been with him through every crisis, every challenge, that Robert was the only person in the company who cared about legacy more than profit. Your father was wrong. I know. And that's what makes this so hard. Not just that Robert betrayed me, but that my father's judgment was so catastrophically flawed. Everything I thought I knew about the company, about loyalty, about who deserves trust, it was all built on a foundation that was rotten from the beginning." James had understood what she wasn't saying. Catherine Sterling wasn't just fighting to clear her name. She was fighting to understand how the world she'd been raised to trust had turned out to be a carefully constructed lie. "Miss Sterling, when this is over, you're going to have choices to make about what kind of company you want to run, what kind of CEO you want to be, but first we have to survive tonight." "I know. I'll see you at 11. She'd hung up, and James had sat with his cooling coffee thinking about choices and consequences and the way justice and revenge sometimes looked identical until you examined your own heart closely enough to tell the difference. At 10:30 p.m., James had changed into dark jeans and a black jacket, left a note for his sister who was watching Sarah, and taken the subway into Manhattan. The night was cold enough to see breath, the kind of December evening that made the city feel sharper, more awake. He'd arrived at the loading dock at 10:55. Catherine was already there, and he almost hadn't recognized her. No $4,000 coat, no Hermes bag. She wore dark jeans that actually fit like she'd worn them before, a black North Face jacket, white sneakers that had been broken in by someone else's feet. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry. She looked younger, more uncertain, and completely unlike the woman who'd walked into his office 3 days ago. "You came prepared?" She'd looked down at herself, something crossing her face that might have been embarrassment or might have been revelation. "I had to buy these. The jeans, the shoes. I haven't owned anything from a normal store since I was 16. The woman at Target looked at me like I was lost. Were you? Completely." They'd moved to the service entrance, a metal door with a keycard reader. Catherine had pulled out her access card, the gold executive version that was supposed to work everywhere in the building. She'd swiped it. Red light. Access denied. "That's not possible. This card has worked for 5 years. James had kept his voice calm, even as his pulse kicked up. "They've started revoking your privileges. Probably happened this afternoon. Do you have the master key your father gave you? That's from 2014. The system was upgraded twice since then." They'd stood in the December cold, Plan A already falling apart, and James had felt the familiar weight of 8 years of work threatening to collapse under the weight of one failed keycard. Then the service door had opened from inside. A delivery driver, Hispanic, maybe 40, pushing a hand truck with boxes toward a waiting van. He'd propped the door with his shoulder while he loaded the truck, and James had made a decision in the space of 3 seconds. He'd walked over, pulled a cigarette from a pack he didn't smoke but kept for exactly these moments. "Hey man, you got a light?" The driver had patted his pockets, handed over a lighter without really looking. People don't examine strangers when they're in the middle of their own work. James had made a show of lighting the cigarette, then palmed the man's keycard from where it hung on his belt clip. 3 seconds, smooth as breathing. "Thanks, brother, appreciate it." He'd returned to Catherine, slipped through the door before it closed, hung the keycard on the inside handle where the driver would find it and think he'd dropped it. They'd moved through the service corridor, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of industrial cleaner and old concrete. Catherine's breathing had been too fast, shoulders up near her ears. "You need to calm down. Fear makes you visible." "How are you so calm?" "Practice and necessity. Drop your shoulders. Breathe from your diaphragm. If we run into anyone, you're my supervisor. New security protocol requires 2-person teams after hours. Can you do that?" She'd nodded, forced her shoulders down, and they'd continued toward the freight elevator. The elevator had been a groaning metal cage that smelled like rust and old metal. Nothing like the sleek executive lifts that Catherine used during business hours. They'd descended into the building's industrial guts, past mechanical rooms and storage, until the doors opened on basement level 2. Climate-controlled cold blue LED strips along the floor, the hum of servers running calculations that kept the financial markets turning. The corridor stretched 30 feet to a reinforced door marked Server Room B2, authorized personnel only. Catherine had walked to the biometric scanner, pressed her thumb to the reader. For 3 seconds that felt like hours, nothing happened. Then, green light, soft click, door seal breaking with a hiss of pressurized air. Inside, rows of server racks stretching toward the back wall, blinking status lights like a city seen from far away. The temperature was 62 degrees, optimized for machines instead of humans. James had pulled out 2 USB drives, moved to the main terminal. "What exactly are you looking for?" "Server access logs for the financial authorization system. Specifically, I need to see every time your digital credentials were used in the last 18 months. He'd logged in using backdoor credentials he'd obtained during his 3rd week as a janitor, when he'd installed a keylogger on this exact terminal. The files appeared, thousands of entries showing every digital signature processed through Sterling Financial's authorization system. James had started the copy protocol. 8 minutes for a complete backup, the progress bar creeping forward with excruciating slowness. 3 minutes in, they'd heard voices in the corridor. Male, authoritative, getting closer. Catherine's eyes had gone wide. James had pulled her behind the nearest server rack, the gap between machines just wide enough for 2 people if they didn't breathe too deep. The door had opened, footsteps, 2 sets, 1 heavy and 1 lighter. "I'm telling you, sir, the system showed a biometric entry at 2314, server room level 2. Could be maintenance. Check the schedule." The voices had belonged to Harrison and a security officer. James had felt Catherine tense beside him, her shoulder pressed against his, both of them barely breathing in the narrow space between expensive machinery. Harrison had walked deeper into the room, close enough that James could have reached out and touched him. 8 years of hunting this man, and now they stood 6 feet apart, separated only by a server rack and the discipline to stay absolutely still. "Nothing looks disturbed, probably a glitch in the biometric log." "Should I file a report?" "No need. But increase patrol frequency on this level for the rest of the week. I want someone checking basement 2 every hour." They'd left. The door had sealed behind them with that same pressurized hiss. Catherine had started to move, but James had kept his hand on her arm. "Wait, count to 100. They'd waited in the cold silence, listening to server fans and their own heartbeats. At 100, James had checked the corridor through the door's small window. Empty. The USB progress bar had hit 100%. He'd ejected both drives, pocketed them in separate jacket pockets in case one got lost, and led Catherine back toward the freight elevator. They'd made it to the loading dock without incident. The December air had felt warm compared to the server room, and Catherine had sagged against the brick wall like her legs had stopped working properly. We almost got caught. Almost doesn't count. He was right there. Robert was right there, and you didn't what? Attack him? That's not how this works. We need him confident and unaware. The moment he knows we have evidence, he starts destroying backup files and calling lawyers. We do this smart or we don't do it at all. Catherine had nodded, but her hands were shaking. James had recognized the adrenaline crash, the way fear catches up after danger passes. Miss Sterling, I need you to go home. Different route than you came. Don't use your car service. Take the subway, get off 3 stops early, walk the rest. Tomorrow act normal. Go to your office, do your work. Don't give any indication that tonight happened. When do we present the evidence? I need to analyze what we copied, correlate it with the other victims' timelines, build an airtight case. 3 days, maybe 4. The board meets in 5 days. Robert has scheduled a vote to remove me. Then we have 4 days to make sure that vote never happens. She'd left, disappearing into the Manhattan night, and James had taken his own advice about different routes. He'd walked 30 blocks before catching a train, the USB drives in his pocket feeling heavier than their actual weight, like they contained not just data but the accumulated gravity of 8 years and 8 victims and 1 dead FBI agent who deserved better than brake failure on a rainy night. He'd arrived home at 1:47 a.m. His sister had fallen asleep on the couch, and James had covered her with a blanket before heading to his office, a converted bedroom that smelled like old paper and determination. The USB drives had contained exactly what he'd hoped for, comprehensive logs showing every access to Catherine's digital credentials. He'd started building the timeline, cross-referencing with her travel schedule, her business calendar, the times when she was provably elsewhere when transactions occurred. October 3rd, 2:17 a.m. Harrison's terminal ID accessing Catherine's signature authentication. October 5th, 3:42 a.m. Same terminal, different access point. The pattern repeated 16 times, always in the dead hours when the building was empty except for security and janitorial staff, people who were, in other words, invisible. James had worked until dawn building spreadsheets and correlation charts, assembling pieces of a puzzle he'd been working on since before Sarah learned to walk. The USB drives held proof of this fraud, but they didn't prove Margaret's murder. For that, he needed Harrison to reveal himself, needed the pressure of exposure to crack open whatever secrets the man had kept buried for 30 years. At 6:15 a.m., Sarah had wandered in, pajamas wrinkled, hair sticking up. "Daddy, did you sleep?" "A little." "You're lying." She'd said it without accusation, just noting a fact. James had pulled her onto his lap, breathing in the kid smell of her, shampoo and sleep and the particular sweetness of 9 years old. "You're right. I'm lying. I was working on something important." "The thing about Mom?" "Yeah, baby, the thing about Mom. Is it almost done?" James had looked at the screens full of evidence, the timeline that spanned 3 decades, the names of victims who'd lost years of their lives to Robert Harrison's carefully constructed fraud. "Almost. Very soon now." Sarah had hugged him, fierce and quick, then pulled away to get ready for school. James had watched her go, thinking about promises kept and promises broken and the way children absorb their parents' obsessions like secondhand smoke. 3 days later, James had compiled 287 pages of evidence, server logs, incorporation documents, HR complaint files that Helen Rodriguez had kept hidden in her basement for 10 years, victim testimony, financial forensics showing money flowing through shell companies like water through a maze that always led back to the same source. He'd presented it to Catherine in his office, watching her face change as she understood the scope of what Harrison had built. Not just fraud, but a system. Not just theft, but a carefully engineered method of destroying anyone who got too close to the truth. "There are 8 victims?" 8 confirmed. I suspect there are more, but these are the ones I can prove. George Thompson served 4 years for embezzlement in Cleveland. Mary Garcia 2 years in Chicago. Dorothy Williams is still serving year 6 of a 12-year sentence in Boston. Catherine had put her hand over her mouth. And your wife? Margaret was number 3. She didn't go to trial because she died before she could present evidence. James, I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. Help me finish this. They'd planned the confrontation for the board meeting, the one where Harrison expected to present his evidence against Catherine and watch her career disintegrate. Instead, they'd walk in with truth that cut deeper than fraud, that exposed not just one criminal but an entire system that had enabled him. The night before the meeting, James had called Sarah from his sister's house in Philadelphia. He'd sent her there for safety after Richard Jr.'s playground cruelty revealed how close the worlds were getting, how soon everything would become public and dangerous. Daddy, when can I come home? Soon, baby. Tomorrow everything changes. Are you scared? The question had caught him off guard, made him pause in a way that let truth slip through. Terrified. Then why are you doing it? Because your mom would, and because I promised her I'd finish what she started, and because if I don't, the bad man hurts more people. What if he hurts you? James had closed his eyes, phone pressed to his ear, thinking about all the ways to lie to your daughter for her own comfort and rejecting everyone. Then you'll know I tried. You'll know I fought for what matters, and someday when you're older, you'll understand that some things are worth the risk. I love you, Daddy. I love you more than the sky, baby. More than all the stars. It was something Margaret used to say back when Sarah was small enough to believe in hyperbole without questioning the math. Now it just hurt. A reminder of everything lost and everything still at stake. The morning of the board meeting, James had dressed in his best suit, the one he'd bought for Margaret's funeral and hadn't worn since. Navy, single-breasted, pressed until the creases could cut. He'd loaded the briefcase with evidence, checked and rechecked the USB drives, rehearsed the presentation until it felt like muscle memory. Catherine had texted at 8 a.m. I'm ready, James had replied. See you there. He'd taken the subway to Midtown, walked the 6 blocks to Sterling Financial, and entered through the main lobby for the first time in 3 months. No service entrance, no janitor's uniform. Just James Cooper, forensic accountant, walking through marble and brass like he belonged there. The elevator to 42 had been the executive model, smooth and silent. Other passengers had given him space without seeming to, the unconscious geography of bodies that marks some people as different, as other, as requiring distance. He'd let them keep their distance. Soon enough, they'd have no choice but to see him. The boardroom fell into the kind of silence that happens when reality shifts faster than minds can process. Robert Harrison stood frozen at the projector, remote control still gripped in his hand, like he'd forgotten how to let go. His presentation about Catherine's crimes glowed behind him, suddenly irrelevant, suddenly exposed as the distraction it had always been. Thomas Miller broke the quiet first, his voice carrying the careful weight of a man who'd survived 6 decades in finance by knowing when the ground was shifting beneath him. Mr. Cooper, you're making serious accusations. Before we proceed, I need to understand your credentials and your relationship to this matter. James set the briefcase on the polished table, the leather worn sought from years of carrying other people's financial disasters. He pulled out the first folder, slid it across to Miller. I'm a certified forensic accountant, 15 years of experience specializing in corporate fraud and embezzlement cases. My relationship to this matter is both professional and personal. Miss Sterling retained my services 4 days ago to investigate the allegations against her. What I found goes back 30 years and involves 8 victims, one of whom was my wife. Elizabeth Brooks leaned forward, reading glasses perched on her nose, the kind of woman who'd built a career on asking questions that made men uncomfortable. Your wife worked in finance? My wife was FBI Special Agent Margaret Cooper. In 2016, she was 3 weeks away from presenting evidence that would have sent Robert Harrison to prison for embezzling $3.2 million from Harrison Holdings in Cleveland. She died in a single vehicle accident on Route 7 in Connecticut. Brake failure. The investigation was closed the day after her funeral. Harrison found his voice, but it came out higher than his usual measured baritone. "This is a conspiracy theory from a grieving husband. I sympathize with your loss, Mr. Cooper, but using this board meeting to, I have the recordings." 4 words delivered with the precision of a surgeon making the first incision. James pulled out the digital recorder, set it in the center of the table, pressed play. Harrison's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. "Catherine's getting too curious about the Dublin accounts. We need to move up the timeline." The second voice. "Like the Thompson woman in 2016? Exactly. Brake failure worked then. Framing works now. Cleaner this way." James stopped the playback, let the words settle like sediment in still water. "I recorded this on December 8th at 2:43 a.m. while working as a janitor on the executive floors. Mr. Harrison was in his office, speaking on his personal cell phone. The conversation was not encrypted. Thompson was my wife's maiden name. She used it professionally." Catherine had been watching Harrison's face, and what she saw there was confirmation of everything she'd feared and worse. The man who'd walked her down the aisle, who'd held her father's hand in the hospital, who'd taught her how to read a balance sheet, was capable of ordering murder with the same casual efficiency he used for quarterly projections. Her voice came out steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Robert, tell them it's not true." But Harrison was looking at James now, really looking, and recognition was dawning across his features like sunrise over something rotten. "You're the janitor. The one who was always on 39. You've been spying on me for months. 3 months, 81 night shifts. You walked past me 46 times, complained about my work 7 times, and treated me like furniture that occasionally needed to be repositioned. You never once looked at my face long enough to see who I actually was." Thomas Miller held up a hand, his patience for drama exhausted by decades of board meetings that should have ended hours before they did. "Gentlemen, personal grievances aside, we have a business matter to resolve. Mr. Cooper, you claim to have evidence that Mr. Harrison, not Miss Sterling, is responsible for the missing $47 million. I'd like to see that evidence now." James distributed the folders he'd prepared, one for each board member. 287 pages condensed into executive summaries with supporting documentation tabbed and color-coded. Catherine watched them flip through the materials, saw the exact moment when skepticism gave way to something colder and more calculating. Pages 1 through 45 contain server access logs showing Mr. Harrison's terminal accessing Miss Sterling's digital signature credentials on 16 separate occasions over 18 months. Each access occurred between 2 and 4 a.m., when the building was empty except for security and cleaning staff. Each access was followed within 72 hours by a wire transfer to one of 3 shell companies: Dublin Holdings, LLC, Singapore Financial Services, or Cayman Trust Limited. He paused, let them absorb the timestamps and IP addresses, the digital trail that was impossible to fake and difficult to explain away. Pages 46 through 120 detail the incorporation documents for those shell companies. Dublin Holdings was registered in Delaware in 1998 with Daniel Harrison as the registered agent. The beneficial owner is listed as RWH Holdings, a private entity controlled by Robert W. Harrison. Singapore Financial Services was incorporated in 2001, same structure. Cayman Trust in 2004. Elizabeth Brooks looked up from the documents, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to something sharper. These shell companies predate Catherine's tenure as CEO by 16 to 22 years. Correct. Miss Sterling was 26 years old when Dublin Holdings was created. She was in graduate school at Wharton, not involved in company operations. Harrison had regained some of his composure, the initial shock fading into defensive calculation. Those are legitimate corporate structures for tax optimization. Perfectly legal entities that have been reviewed by our external auditors multiple times. Tax optimization that resulted in $186 million being transferred from Sterling Financial to personal accounts in the Bahamas registered under your name. I have the bank statements, Mr. Harrison. Would you like me to distribute those as well? The color drained from Harrison's face again, faster this time. Thomas Miller closed his folder with the kind of finality that comes before difficult decisions. Robert, I think you should stop talking and call your attorney. But Harrison wasn't looking at Miller. He was staring at James with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Every detail he'd planned for decades suddenly revealed as inadequate against an enemy he hadn't known existed. You've been planning this for years, the janitor job, the recordings, befriending Catherine. This whole thing is a setup. James met his gaze without flinching. I've been documenting your crimes for 8 years, across Cleveland, Chicago, Boston, and now New York. You're right about one thing, though. I have been planning. Every night shift, every conversation I overheard, every file I copied when you thought the cleaning staff was too invisible to matter. I planned very carefully. Catherine's hands had stopped shaking. Something was crystallizing in her chest, hardening from fear into something more useful. She stood, drawing the attention of 12 board members who'd known her since she was a child attending company holiday parties. I'm calling for an emergency vote. Robert Harrison should be suspended immediately, all access to company systems revoked and law enforcement contacted. I also recommend freezing all accounts connected to the shell companies James has identified. Thomas Miller nodded slowly. I second the motion. All in favor? 11 hands went up. Only Harrison abstained, his face now pale as paper, sweat beading along his hairline despite the climate-controlled boardroom. This is a mistake. You're all making a terrible mistake. Elizabeth Brooks' voice carried the particular coldness of someone who'd just realized they'd been lied to for 20 years. The only mistake was trusting you, Robert. Security will escort you to collect your personal effects. Do not access any computer systems, do not remove any company documents, and do not contact any employees. If you violate these conditions, we'll have you arrested for trespassing before the police arrive for the fraud charges. 2 security officers entered the boardroom as if they'd been waiting for the cue, which perhaps they had. Corporate security learned to anticipate when executives became liabilities. They flanked Harrison, professional and impassive. As they led him toward the door, Harrison turned back one final time. You've destroyed me over a woman who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was collateral damage, nothing personal. The brake failure was only supposed to scare her into backing off. It wasn't supposed to... He stopped, finally understanding what he'd just said. The boardroom went absolutely still. James felt something crack open in his chest, 8 years of controlled fury finding the smallest release. His voice came out soft, which made it more dangerous. Her name was Margaret. She was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in criminal justice and a 1-year-old daughter. She believed in justice even when the system failed to deliver it, and you don't even remember her name. Security pulled Harrison through the door before he could respond. The sound of it closing felt like punctuation on a sentence that had taken too long to finish. Thomas Miller stood, suddenly looking older than his 68 years. Catherine, I owe you an apology. We all do. We should have looked deeper before scheduling this vote. But Catherine was watching James, seeing the way his hands had formed fists and then consciously relaxed, the way his breathing had gone shallow and then steadied, the physical battle between rage and discipline playing out in real time. James, are you... I need to make a phone call. He left the boardroom, walked to the elevator, descended to the lobby and stepped out onto 6th Avenue where December wind cut through his suit jacket like it was hunting for the vulnerable places. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, dialed the number he knew by heart. Sarah answered on the second ring. Daddy? Hey, baby, it's done. We got him. The bad man who hurt Mom? Yeah, he's not going to hurt anyone else. He heard her crying through the phone, the kind of tears that come from relief rather than pain, and found his own face wet despite the cold air evaporating moisture almost as fast as it formed. Can I come home now? Not yet. The news is going to be everywhere in the next few days, reporters, cameras, people asking questions. I need you safe at Aunt Laura's until it settles. But soon, baby, very soon. Promise? Promise, promise. After she hung up, James stood on the sidewalk, letting Manhattan flow around him. 8 years of hunting, 3 months of janitorial work, 4 nights of planning the break-in, and it had all come down to 16 minutes in a boardroom and one confession that Harrison hadn't meant to make. Catherine found him there 20 minutes later, her coat wrapped tight against wind that made her eyes water. The board wants to meet with you tomorrow. They're talking about bringing you on as head of corporate ethics, 6-figure salary, full benefits. I don't want their job. I know, but they're going to offer anyway because it makes them feel less complicit. Rich people throw money at problems when they can't face their own failure. She said it without bitterness, just observation honed by 36 years of watching how power insulated itself from consequence. James, can I ask you something? Go ahead. When we were in the server room and Harrison almost caught us, why didn't you do something? You could have confronted him right there, ended it. James thought about the question. About all the nights he'd imagined exactly that scenario, the satisfying fantasy of making Harrison look him in the eyes and know, really know, what he'd taken. Because I needed him confident, needed him to think he'd gotten away with it one more time. People make mistakes when they think they're untouchable. That recording, the confession in the boardroom, those only happened because he didn't see me coming until it was too late. The art of being invisible, the only art that mattered. They stood together in the wind, watching yellow cabs navigate gridlock, until Catherine's phone started buzzing with news alerts. The story was already breaking. Financial journalists who'd been tipped by board members with agendas James couldn't begin to map. By tomorrow morning, his face would be on CNBC, his name in the Wall Street Journal, his 8-year hunt transformed into content for people who'd forget about it before lunch. I should go, prepare for whatever comes next. Catherine pulled a business card from her coat, pressed it into his hand. My personal cell. Not the CEO number, the one I give to actual friends. When this gets overwhelming, and it will, call me. You saved my life, James. That's not a debt I take lightly. She left in a car service that had appeared as if summoned by wealth itself. And James walked to the subway because that's what you did when you'd spent 8 years building a case on a janitor's salary supplemented by forensic accounting work that barely covered rent. The train back to Brooklyn was crowded with evening commuters, people pressed together in forced intimacy, all of them looking at phones or windows or nothing. Masters of urban invisibility. James found a corner and let his mind finally process what had happened. Harrison was finished. The confession had been recorded by the board's automatic meeting transcription system. Admissible in court, impossible to walk back. The FBI would reopen Margaret's case. The victims would get their names cleared. Catherine would survive with her reputation intact. Everything he'd worked for had come to fruition in a single morning. So why did he feel empty instead of victorious? The answer came from Sarah's voice on the phone, the question she'd asked that he'd deflected. Can I come home now? Because home had been defined by absence for 8 years, by the ghost of Margaret and the hunt for her killer, and now that the hunt was over, he didn't know what home looked like without it. His phone buzzed. Text from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Cooper, this is FBI Special Agent Barbara Clark. I worked with Margaret in the Cleveland field office. I've been following the Sterling case since the news broke 2 hours ago. I'd like to discuss reopening your wife's investigation. Can we meet tomorrow? James stared at the message, feeling pieces of his carefully constructed emotional walls start to crumble. Margaret's case, officially closed for 8 years, might finally get the investigation it deserved. Justice delayed was better than justice denied, but the delay had cost him time with Sarah that he'd never get back. Birthday parties missed because he was tracking financial records, school plays skipped because he had a lead in Chicago that turned into nothing. He texted back, 2 p.m., my office in Brooklyn. The train rattled through the tunnel, lights flickering as they always did between stations, and James closed his eyes against the fluorescent glare. Tomorrow would bring reporters and lawyers and FBI agents asking questions he'd answered in his mind 10,000 times. But tonight, he just wanted to sit in his brownstone kitchen and remember what Margaret's laugh sounded like. The sound that had gotten quieter in his memory with each passing year until he wasn't sure anymore if he was remembering accurately or just remembering the memory. Helen Rodriguez was waiting on his stoop when he got home, wrapped in a winter coat that had seen better decades, holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. She'd worked HR at Sterling Financial for 30 years, before retiring in 2022, one of the invisible people who saw everything and were expected to forget it all. I saw the news, figured you hadn't eaten. Helen, you didn't have to. I know I didn't have to. I wanted to. For 10 years I kept those files in my basement after they told me to destroy them, wondering if they'd ever matter. You cared, James, you cared when it cost you everything. She pushed the casserole into his hands, warm through the foil, the smell of home cooking fighting against December cold. My granddaughter's taking the LSAT next month. She wants to be a prosecutor. I told her about you, about how one person can make a difference if they're willing to pay the price. She said you're a hero. I'm not a hero. I'm just a father who needed his daughter to see that some promises don't break even when everything else does. Helen patted his cheek with a grandmother's gentle authority. That's exactly what heroes say. Eat the chicken, James, and get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be harder than today. She left him standing on the stoop with warm food and cold truth. And James carried both inside to a brownstone that felt larger now that the hunt was over. Rooms that had been filled with purpose suddenly revealing themselves as just rooms. He ate the chicken at his kitchen table, looking at Margaret's photo on the mantel. We got him, Margaret. It's over. The photo didn't answer, of course, but in the dim kitchen light, Margaret's smile looked like forgiveness for all the ways he'd failed to be present, failed to move on, failed to be the father Sarah deserved. Because he'd been too busy being the husband Margaret would never know she'd lost. His phone buzzed again. Catherine. News cameras are outside my building. Reporters asking about the janitor who took down a Wall Street executive. How are you holding up? I'm fine. You're lying. I've gotten very good at recognizing lies this week. James smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at his edges. Okay. I'm completely overwhelmed and have no idea what to do with myself now that the thing I've been focused on for 8 years is suddenly finished. That's better. Want some advice from someone who just had her entire worldview shattered? Sure. Don't make any major decisions for at least a month. Don't talk to reporters without a lawyer present, and definitely don't turn down the job offer from Sterling Financial because you think you don't deserve success. You earned this, James. Let yourself have it. After she hung up, James sat in his quiet kitchen and thought about deserving, about earning, about the difference between justice and revenge and whether the line between them was as clear as he'd told Sarah it was. He'd gotten Harrison arrested, exposed, finished. But Margaret was still dead. The years with Sarah were still lost. The cost of the hunt remained paid regardless of the outcome. The next morning brought FBI Special Agent Barbara Clark to his office. A woman in her mid-40s with the particular weariness of someone who'd spent 20 years watching the system fail more often than it succeeded. She carried a file box marked with Margaret's case number, set it on James's desk like an offering. I've read your evidence packet, the recording, the financial forensics, everything. It's brilliant work, the kind of work Margaret would have been proud of. You worked with her? Cleveland Field Office, 2014 to 2017. She was the best investigator I've ever seen. Relentless, detail-oriented, and absolutely convinced that financial crimes mattered just as much as violent ones because they destroyed lives in slower, more invisible ways. Barbara opened the file box, pulled out photographs of Margaret's car after it had been pulled from the ravine. James had seen crime scene photos before in his forensic work, but these were different. This was Margaret's blue Honda Civic, the one they'd bought together when Sarah was born because it had good safety ratings and they were thinking about the future. The original investigation focused on the brake failure. Mechanic confirmed the brake lines had been severed, but the ruling was that it happened from road debris, not deliberate tampering. Case closed. But you never believed that. I couldn't prove anything else. Margaret's evidence against Harrison disappeared from the FBI database the day after her accident. The backup files were corrupted. Her notes were missing from her office. It was too clean, too convenient. But without proof, I couldn't do anything except watch the case get closed and archived. Barbara pulled out another document, this one marked with red flags that indicated new evidence. Your recording changes everything. Harrison admitting that the brake failure worked in 2016? That's conspiracy to commit murder. I've already spoken to the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're opening a full investigation. James felt something unclench in his chest that had been tight for so long he'd forgotten it could release. What do you need from me? Everything you have on Harrison's movements in November 2016, phone records, financial transactions, any evidence that connects him to Andrew Mitchell. Who's Andrew Mitchell? Private investigator out of Hartford. Died in 2019, but I pulled his phone records from the time period around Margaret's death. He received a $50,000 wire transfer from one of Harrison's shell companies on November 10, 2016. 2 days later, Margaret died. I couldn't prove a connection then, but with the recording, you can establish that Harrison hired someone to tamper with her car. Exactly. Mitchell's dead, so we can't get his testimony, but we can build a circumstantial case that becomes very difficult to defend against when combined with Harrison's recorded confession. They spent the next 3 hours going through James's files, 8 years of documentation that had been building toward exactly this moment. Barbara took notes with the focused intensity of someone who'd been waiting a long time for a second chance. James, I have to ask, why didn't you come to the FBI years ago with this evidence? He thought about all the reasons, the cynicism that comes from watching institutions fail. The knowledge that a black man accusing a wealthy white executive of murder would be dismissed as grief-motivated conspiracy. The simple fact that he hadn't trusted anyone to care as much as he did because I needed to be absolutely certain. Because I needed evidence so overwhelming that it couldn't be ignored or buried. And because 8 years ago I was angry and broken and didn't trust that the system would do what it was supposed to do. Do you trust it now? I trust you. That's different from trusting the system. Barbara smiled, sad and knowing. Fair enough. I'll work with what you're giving me. But James, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that even with all this evidence, Harrison might not be convicted of Margaret's murder. The statute of limitations hasn't run out, but proving conspiracy when the actual perpetrator is dead is complicated. He'll definitely go to prison for the fraud, but murder, I know. I've known from the beginning that justice for Margaret might be incomplete, but getting Harrison locked up for anything is better than watching him walk free while Margaret stays dead and 8 other victims carry the weight of his crimes. After Barbara left, James sat alone in his office, surrounded by 8 years of paperwork that would now be cataloged as evidence in a federal case. His phone kept buzzing with interview requests from reporters, offers from publishers who wanted to turn the story into a book, emails from corporate headhunters who'd seen his name in the news and smelled opportunity. He ignored them all and called his sister. Laura, can you put Sarah on? James, the news is everywhere. Kids at school are asking her questions. She needs to come home. I know. I'm coming to get her this afternoon. Is she okay? She's worried about you. Says you sounded tired when you called yesterday. When Sarah's voice came through, small and concerned, James felt the familiar ache of being simultaneously the most important person in someone's life and chronically absent from it. "Daddy, Aunt Laura says you're famous now." "I'm not famous, baby. I'm just someone who did what needed to be done." "Will you have to go away again for work?" The question hit harder than it should have, revealing the damage that 8 years of distraction had caused. "No, I'm taking time off. We're going to spend every day together for a while. I'll teach you to make pancakes that aren't burned. We'll go to the science museum. We'll watch all those documentaries you like about space and time and how the universe works. Promise?" "Promise, promise." He drove to Philadelphia that afternoon, the traffic on I-95 giving him time to think about what came next. The job offer from Sterling Financial sat in his inbox, unanswered. 6 figures, full benefits, the chance to build corporate ethics programs that might prevent the next Robert Harrison from destroying the next 8 victims. It was meaningful work, important work, the kind of career Margaret would have encouraged him to take. But it also meant staying in the world of financial fraud and corporate malfeasance, spending his days looking for the next disaster instead of being present for the daughter who'd grown up in the shadow of the last one. Laura's house in West Philadelphia smelled like dinner cooking and normal life, the kind of domestic stability that James had sacrificed in favor of obsession. Sarah ran to him when he walked through the door, wrapped her arms around his waist with the fierce grip of 9 years old who'd learned not to take presents for granted. "I saw you on TV. They said you're a hero who caught a bad guy." "TV exaggerates. I'm just your dad who's very sorry for being away so much." "Are you sad about Mom?" "Always, but I'm also happy we got justice for her. Those two things can exist together." They drove back to Brooklyn through early winter darkness, Sarah chattering about school and friends and a science fair project on renewable energy that she wanted to build together. James listened, really listened, hearing between the words to the loneliness that had shaped her childhood, the absences that had taught her to be self-sufficient before she should have needed to be. "Daddy, what happens to the bad man now?" "He goes to trial, probably goes to prison for a very long time." "Does that make you feel better?" The question was too perceptive for 9 years old, but Sarah had always been that way, seeing through adult deflections with the clarity that comes before life teaches you to accept comfortable lies. "It makes me feel like I kept my promise to your mom. Whether that's the same as feeling better, I don't know yet." They pulled up to the brownstone as snow started to fall, the first of the season, turning Brooklyn into something softer than its usual concrete edges. James carried Sarah's bag inside, started making dinner while she did homework at the kitchen table, and felt the strange sensation of time moving at normal speed instead of the accelerated pace that had defined 8 years of hunting. His phone buzzed. Thomas Miller. "James, the board met this afternoon. We'd like to extend a formal offer for the position of Chief Ethics Officer. 180,000 base salary, full benefits, equity package, and complete authority to investigate any aspect of company operations without board approval required. You'd report directly to Catherine." "I need time to think about it." "Of course. But James, I want you to understand something. What Robert did, what we allowed to happen by not asking harder questions, that's on us. We can't undo it, but we can make sure it never happens again. And you're the only person I trust to build that system." After Miller hung up, James looked at Sarah working on math problems, tongue poking out in concentration the way Margaret's used to when she was focused. The job meant stability, college fund contributions, the ability to stop worrying about rent and property taxes and whether he could afford to fix the boiler when it inevitably broke. But it also meant time away from moments like this. Homework at the kitchen table and snow falling outside and the simple presence that Sarah had been asking for in a dozen different ways for 8 years. He pulled out his laptop, composed an email declining the chief ethics officer position, but offering to consult on building the ethics program. Hourly rate, limited hours per week, maintaining the flexibility to be present instead of successful in the ways that success was usually measured. The next 3 months passed in a blur of depositions and grand jury testimony and news cycles that chewed through the story until the next scandal emerged to feed the public appetite for institutional failure. Robert Harrison was indicted on 27 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Margaret Cooper. The trial date was set for June, giving James half a year to prepare testimony and watch his face gradually disappear from headlines as other, newer disasters emerged to feed the cultural moment. Dorothy Williams was released from prison in February, her conviction overturned based on evidence that Harrison had framed her using the same methods he'd used on Catherine. James had driven to Boston to meet her outside the prison gates, watched her reunite with children who'd grown from 6 and 4 to 14 and 12 in her absence. She'd hugged him with the fierce gratitude of someone who'd stopped believing in rescue and then received it anyway. I told myself for 6 years that the truth would come out eventually. I almost stopped believing it. The truth doesn't always come out. Sometimes it needs help. Then thank you for being the help. George Thompson's conviction was vacated in March. His name cleared after 12 years of living with a criminal record that had destroyed his career and marriage. He'd called James from Cleveland, voice shaking with something between joy and fury that justice had taken more than a decade to find him. They can't give me back the years, can't fix what my kids think of me, growing up believing their father was a criminal. No. But they can make sure the next person doesn't lose 12 years. Is that supposed to make me feel better? No. It's supposed to make you feel like your suffering had meaning. Whether that's enough is something only you can decide. Mary Garcia had been easier, her 2 years in prison a lighter sentence, but no less devastating for the time they'd cost. She'd taken the settlement from Sterling Financial's Victims Fund and used it to pay for her daughter's college tuition. Called James to thank him, but also to ask the question that kept coming up in different forms from different victims. Why? Why did you care about us when nobody else did? Because my wife cared. And because once you see how the system fails, you can't unsee it. You either fight or you become complicit. Which are you? Still trying to figure that out. Catherine had stepped down as CEO in April. Not because the board forced her, but because she'd looked at the company her father built and realized she didn't want to spend her life managing the same structures that had enabled Harrison's crimes. She'd established the Thompson Cooper Justice Fund with $50 million from her personal wealth, dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted individuals and funding forensic investigations into suspected corporate fraud. She'd called James to discuss the foundation's structure, her voice different than it had been in his office 9 months earlier. Less polished, more certain. I've been thinking about what you said, about how I'd never understood what it meant to be invisible until I had to dress like a normal person and walk past my own doorman without being recognized. That was a crash course in privilege awareness. It was humiliating and necessary. I can't undo 36 years of being insulated from reality. But I can make sure the next generation of executives doesn't have the same blindness. That's a good start. James, the foundation needs a director, someone who understands both financial forensics and what it costs to fight when the system is stacked against you. I know you turned down the corporate job, but this is different. You'd be helping people like Dorothy and George, giving them resources to prove their innocence. Let me think about it. Take your time. But James, you're good at this, not just the forensic work, but the human part, the caring when caring is expensive and exhausting. Don't waste that because you think you need to punish yourself for prioritizing justice over presence. 3 weeks later, after Sarah's science fair, where she'd won first place with a project on renewable energy, James had called Catherine back. The foundation director position. If the offer still stands, I'll take it. Part-time, 20 hours a week maximum. I need to be home for Sarah. Catherine's relief had been audible through the phone. Deal. You start after the trial concludes, however that ends. The words had stayed with him for weeks, circling through his thoughts while he helped Sarah with homework and made dinner and tried to remember what it felt like to live without the weight of an 8-year hunt pressing on his shoulders. In May, 3 weeks before Harrison's trial was scheduled to begin, FBI agent Barbara called with news that made James sit down hard in his kitchen chair. "We found the mechanic who tampered with Margaret's car. I thought Mitchell was dead." "He is, but Mitchell subcontracted the actual work to a mechanic in Hartford named David Anderson. Anderson's been carrying guilt for 9 years, finally decided to come forward when he saw the news about Harrison's arrest. He has photographs of the brake lines before and after he cut them, time-stamped, along with text messages from Mitchell giving him instructions." James's voice came out steady despite the trembling in his hands. "Can he testify?" "He's willing to testify in exchange for immunity. U.S. Attorney is still deciding, but with his testimony we can prove the mechanical tampering was deliberate, connect it to Mitchell through the photographs and texts, and connect Mitchell to Harrison through the wire transfer. It's not airtight, but it's stronger than anything we had before." "What are the chances of conviction?" "On the murder conspiracy charge, maybe 60%. But James, even if the jury doesn't convict on murder, he's going away for the rest of his life on the fraud charges. 27 counts of wire fraud carries a maximum sentence of 540 years. Realistically, he'll get 25 to 30 years. At 58, that's effectively a life sentence. But it's not justice for Margaret. No, it's not. Justice would be having her alive, raising Sarah, doing the work she was brilliant at. What we have instead is accountability, which is what the system can deliver when it works the way it's supposed to." After Barbara hung up, James sat in the kitchen where he'd made breakfast for Sarah 9,000 mornings, where he'd plotted Harrison's downfall, where Margaret's photo watched from the mantel with patient eyes that would never age beyond 34. He thought about accountability versus justice, about the difference between what you deserve and what you get, about whether 9 years of one man's guilt was worth the price of his testimony if it meant Harrison would finally face consequences for ordering Margaret's death. The answer, unsatisfying and incomplete, was that it had to be worth it because the alternative was letting Harrison die of old age in a comfortable retirement, insulated by wealth from every consequence except the ones James had forced into existence through sheer stubborn refusal to let go. Sarah found him there an hour later, still sitting at the table with sun coffee and colder thoughts. "Daddy, you're doing the faraway thing again." "Sorry, baby, just thinking." "About Mom?" "Always about Mom, one way or another." She climbed into his lap even though at 9 she was almost too big for it, pressed her face against his shoulder with the kind of trust that children give before the world teaches them to be careful. "Is it okay if I don't remember her very much? I was really little when she died." The question broke something in James that he didn't know was still intact. "Of course it's okay. You were only 1 year old. Nobody remembers being one. But you remember everything about her. That's my job, to remember for both of us until you're old enough to carry your own memories. Will you tell me stories? Real ones, not just the sad parts about how she died." So James told her about meeting Margaret at Howard University, about how she'd corrected his calculator placement and made him laugh in the same breath, about their wedding in a small church in Cleveland with 50 people who'd loved them both. He told her about Margaret's obsession with documentaries about space exploration, her terrible cooking that they'd both pretended was edible, the way she'd sung Stevie Wonder songs off-key while folding laundry. By the time he finished, Sarah was smiling and James realized he was too, the first genuine smile in 9 months that wasn't covering something darker underneath. "She sounds nice. She was extraordinary, and so are you." The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan smelled like marble and institutional coffee, the kind of building that had witnessed a century of justice delayed and occasionally delivered. James sat on a bench outside courtroom 14B, watching lawyers in expensive suits navigate hallways like they owned the geometry of the space itself. June sunlight filtered through windows too high to reach, painting everything in the pale gold of mid-morning. Sarah sat beside him, legs swinging because her feet didn't quite touch the floor, wearing the navy dress they'd bought specifically for this day. She'd wanted to come, insisted really, with the particular stubbornness she'd inherited from both her parents. "When do we go in?" "Soon. They're doing jury selection today. We're not testifying until next week." "Will the bad man be there?" James looked down at his daughter, seeing the mix of fear and curiosity that came from knowing someone had killed your mother but having no direct memory of the loss. Sarah's grief was second-hand, learned from James's absences and the photo on the mantel, abstract in the way that death is abstract to children who haven't yet understood their own mortality. "Yes, Mr. Harrison will be there, but he can't hurt us. There are guards and lawyers and rules about how trials work. Are you scared to see him?" The question deserved honesty, even though honesty was harder than deflection. "I'm angry. That's different from scared." Catherine arrived 10 minutes later, dressed in a gray suit that split the difference between her old corporate uniform and the more casual clothes she'd adopted since leaving Sterling Financial. She'd cut her hair shorter, stopped wearing the expensive jewelry that had once been as much part of her identity as her name. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but she was trying. "James, Sarah, the prosecution team wants to meet before we go in. Are you ready?" As ready as someone can be to watch the man who killed their wife sit 20 feet away and claim innocence. They followed Catherine to a conference room where Assistant U.S. Attorney Patricia Carter was reviewing notes with the focused intensity of someone who'd built a career on preparation. She was 42, sharp-featured, with the particular weariness of prosecutors who'd seen too many guilty people walk free on technicalities. "Mr. Cooper, thank you for coming early. I wanted to walk through your testimony one more time." They spent 90 minutes going over details that James had lived with for 9 years, questions Patricia would ask and answers he'd practiced until they felt like muscle memory. The financial forensics, the timeline of Harrison's crimes, the 8 victims whose lives had been destroyed by fraud that looked legitimate until you knew where to look. But the hardest part would be testifying about Margaret. Making a jury of 12 strangers understand. Not just that she'd died, but who she'd been, what her death had cost beyond the clinical facts of brake failure and cliffsides and investigations that ended too soon. The defense is going to argue that you have a financial motive to fabricate evidence. They'll point out that you worked as a janitor specifically to gather information on Harrison, that you had years to construct a narrative that fits your theory of the crime. Let them argue. The server logs don't lie. The shell company documents are public record, and Harrison's own recorded confession puts him at the scene of a conspiracy he's claiming never happened. Patricia nodded, satisfied with the confidence in his voice, even if she knew from experience that confidence wasn't the same as certainty. "One more thing. David Anderson, the mechanic who tampered with the brake lines, is testifying tomorrow. The defense is going to attack his credibility hard. He's testifying in exchange for immunity, which makes him look like someone who'll say anything to avoid prison. Your job is to be the steady, factual counterweight. No emotion, no theatrics, just the evidence." "I can do that." After the meeting, they filed into the courtroom, a space designed to intimidate with its high ceilings and dark wood paneling. The American flag and state flag flanking a bench where Judge Ruth Wilson presided with the stern efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for 23 years. Robert Harrison sat at the defense table between 2 attorneys who'd cost more per hour than most people made in a week. He looked older than he had 9 months ago, the weight loss and gray pallor that came from pretrial detention. But his suit was still tailored, his posture still upright, maintaining the performance of innocence even as the evidence stacked against him like sandbags against a flood. He glanced toward James once, their eyes meeting across the courtroom, and James saw something that might have been fear or might have been hatred. Either way, it was the first time Harrison had looked at him and truly seen him, stripped of the invisibility that janitorial work had provided. The jury selection took all day, a process of questions and strikes and sidebar conferences that turned 12 random citizens into arbiters of truth. By the time Judge Wilson dismissed them for the evening, James felt hollowed out by the weight of waiting, by watching Harrison sit there looking almost normal, like any other executive accused of white-collar crime instead of a man who'd ordered someone's death with the same casual efficiency he'd used for quarterly projections. Sarah had fallen asleep against his shoulder during the afternoon session, and he carried her out to the car service that Catherine had insisted on providing despite his protests about accepting favors. "James, you can't take the subway home after testifying all day. Accept the help." "I'm not a charity case. No, you're someone who exposed massive fraud and caught his wife's killer. Let people help you celebrate that instead of treating assistance like an insult to your independence." In the car, Sarah woke up enough to ask the question that had probably been forming all day. "Daddy, is it always like this? Court, I mean. Lots of waiting and nothing happening?" "Usually. Justice is slow because it's trying to be careful. Better to take time and get it right than rush and let guilty people go free." "Did they get it right with Mom?" James looked out at Manhattan sliding past, evening traffic turning the city into a river of brake lights and frustrated honking. "No, they got it wrong the first time. That's why we're here now trying to fix it." That night, he couldn't sleep. The brownstone was quiet except for the usual sounds of old houses settling, radiators ticking, Brooklyn existing outside his windows. James sat in his office surrounded by 8 years of documentation that had become exhibits in a federal trial, his contribution to the historical record reduced to numbered evidence bags and legal filings. His phone buzzed. "Catherine. Can't sleep either?" Sitting in that courtroom watching Harrison pretend to be the victim, it's surreal, like watching someone rewrite history while the truth sits right there in document form. That's what trials are. Competing narratives where the one with better lawyers sometimes wins regardless of facts. That's a cynical perspective from someone who just spent 9 months building an airtight case. James leaned back in his chair, looking at Margaret's photo on his desk, the version of her that would stay 34 forever while he aged past her, growing into the man she'd never get to know. "I'm a realist. I know we have strong evidence. I also know that juries are human, and humans can be convinced of almost anything if the story is compelling enough. Harrison's defense is going to paint him as a successful executive targeted by a grieving husband with an obsession. Frame the whole thing as prosecutorial overreach driven by my personal vendetta. Is that what this was? A vendetta?" The question sat between them on the phone line, heavy with implications about motive and justice and the difference between revenge and accountability. It started as one. Grief turned into anger, turned into purpose. But somewhere along the way it became about more than Margaret, about Dorothy Williams and George Thompson and all the people Harrison destroyed because the system let him. If that's a vendetta, I'll wear the label. "James, you're allowed to want justice for your wife without it being noble or systemic. It's okay to just be angry that someone took her from you." After she hung up, James sat with that permission, turning it over in his mind. For 9 years, he'd framed his hunt in terms of pattern and precedent, multiple victims and institutional failure. It had been easier to carry that way, to make his pain about something larger than one man's grief. But the truth, sharp and uncomfortable, was that he would have hunted Harrison just as relentlessly if Margaret had been the only victim. The other cases mattered, but they weren't why he'd taken a janitor job and worked night shifts and missed Sarah's childhood. That had all been for Margaret, selfish and singular, and exactly the kind of obsession that defense attorneys would use to paint him as unstable. The trial began in earnest the next morning with opening statements that felt like theater, lawyers performing truth for an audience of 12 plus the alternates. Patricia Carter laid out the prosecution's case with methodical precision, building from financial fraud to conspiracy to murder, connecting dots that formed a picture of 3 decades of crime. The evidence will show that Robert Harrison systematically embezzled $186 million from multiple companies over 30 years. When investigators got too close, he framed innocent people, destroying their lives to protect his own wealth. And when FBI Special Agent Margaret Cooper was 3 weeks away from exposing his crimes, he hired someone to cut her brake lines and stage an accident. The evidence will prove all of this beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense attorney, Charles Sullivan, was everything Patricia Carter wasn't. Theatrical where she was precise, emotional where she was clinical. A performer who understood that trials were won as much on personality as evidence. The prosecution wants you to believe that Robert Harrison is a criminal mastermind who somehow operated undetected for 3 decades, but the real story is simpler and sadder. James Cooper lost his wife in a tragic accident 9 years ago. Unable to accept that loss, he constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory and then spent years manufacturing evidence to support it. He took a job under false pretenses, conducted illegal surveillance, and pressured witnesses into providing testimony that fit his preconceived narrative. The prosecution's entire case rests on the unreliable foundation of a grieving husband's obsession. Sarah, sitting in the gallery, had whispered loud enough for the people around them to hear. "That's not true. Daddy didn't make anything up." James had squeezed her hand, grateful for her faith even as he understood that faith wasn't evidence, and juries needed more than a daughter's belief to convict. David Anderson took the stand on day 2, a mechanic in his 50s who'd carried 9 years of guilt in the slope of his shoulders and the way he couldn't meet anyone's eyes directly. He testified about the night Andrew Mitchell had paid him $5,000 to cut the brake lines on a blue Honda Civic, about the photographs he'd taken as insurance in case anything went wrong, about the text messages that proved Mitchell had ordered the tampering. Sullivan had destroyed him on cross-examination, making him admit to accepting money for sabotage, pointing out that his immunity deal gave him every incentive to lie, suggesting that the photographs could have been staged years later to support a false narrative. "Mr. Anderson, isn't it true that you only came forward after seeing news coverage that made Robert Harrison look guilty? Isn't it convenient that your sudden attack of conscience came with a promise of immunity?" Anderson had wilted under the questioning, his testimony losing credibility with each defensive answer. By the time he left the stand, James could see several jurors looking skeptical, the seed of doubt planted exactly as the defense intended. Patricia Carter had tried to rehabilitate the testimony on redirect, but the damage was done. Reasonable doubt had entered the courtroom like smoke, invisible but pervasive. James testified on day 4, after 3 days of financial experts and FBI agents and document authentication specialists who'd established the fraud but couldn't speak to the human cost. He took the stand wearing the same suit he'd worn to the boardroom 9 months ago, the one that split the difference between professional credibility and working-class authenticity. Patricia Carter walked him through his credentials first, establishing expertise in forensic accounting before moving to the personal history that made his testimony both powerful and vulnerable to attack. "Mr. Cooper, please tell the jury about your wife, Margaret." James had prepared for this question, practiced the answer until it felt smooth. But sitting in the witness box looking at 12 strangers who would decide whether Margaret's death mattered enough to call it murder, the practiced words felt inadequate. Margaret Cooper was an FBI special agent assigned to the Cleveland field office. She specialized in financial crimes, white-collar fraud, and embezzlement cases. She was 34 when she died, brilliant at her job and the kind of person who believed that justice mattered even when it was difficult to achieve. What was she investigating in November of 2016? Robert Harrison. He was CFO of Harrison Holdings at the time. Margaret had built a case showing that he'd embezzled $3.2 million over 4 years, using shell companies to hide the money. She was scheduled to present evidence to a grand jury on December 1st. What happened before she could testify? On November 12th, her car went off Route 7 in Connecticut. The official investigation ruled it an accident caused by brake failure from road debris. Did you believe that conclusion? James met Harrison's eyes across the courtroom before answering, holding the gaze until the other man looked away. No. Margaret had the car serviced 2 days before she died. The brakes were fine, and the timing was too convenient. 3 weeks before she was set to testify, she dies in a single vehicle accident, and the evidence she'd compiled disappears from FBI servers. I never believed it was an accident. What did you do with that belief? I started my own investigation, tracked Harrison's movements over the next 8 years, documented a pattern of fraud and victim framing that matched what Margaret had uncovered. When I learned he was CFO at Sterling Financial, I took a job as a janitor to gather evidence from inside the company. Sullivan objected repeatedly during the testimony, trying to exclude anything that suggested premeditation or planning. But Judge Wilson allowed most of it, understanding that motive and credibility were inextricably linked in a case built on circumstantial evidence. The cross-examination began after lunch, Sullivan standing close enough to the witness box to invade James's personal space, a power move designed to intimidate. Mr. Cooper, you've spent 9 years convinced that my client killed your wife, correct? I've spent 9 years documenting evidence that proves he ordered her death. But you can't actually prove that, can you? You have no direct evidence connecting Robert Harrison to the mechanical tampering of your wife's vehicle. I have a recorded confession where he admits the brake failure worked in 2016. I have financial records showing he paid Andrew Mitchell $50,000 2 days before Margaret died. I have testimony from the mechanic who actually cut the brake lines. The only thing I don't have is video footage of Harrison ordering the hit. But conspiracy cases are rarely that tidy. Sullivan smiled, the expression of a lawyer who'd just gotten the answer he wanted. So you've constructed a theory based on circumstantial evidence and coincidence, spent years building a case to support that theory. And now you're asking this jury to convict my client of murder based on your interpretation of events. I'm asking the jury to look at the evidence objectively. The server logs that prove fraud, the shell company documents that trace back to Harrison, the victims who were framed using identical methods, and yes, the suspicious timing of my wife's death. If they examine all of that and still think it's coincidence, then they'll vote accordingly. But you're not objective, are you, Mr. Cooper? You took a job under false pretenses. You recorded private conversations without consent. You broke into secure areas of Sterling Financial to access confidential files. These aren't the actions of an objective investigator. James had known this attack was coming, had prepared for it with Patricia Carter during their practice sessions, but knowing didn't make it easier to sit there while someone described his 9-year hunt as obsession rather than justice. I did what was necessary to expose the truth. If that makes me biased, then every detective who ever worked a murder case involving someone they cared about is equally compromised. The evidence speaks for itself regardless of my personal investment in the outcome. Does it? Or does the evidence look different when viewed through the lens of your grief? When you desperately want someone to blame for a loss you can't accept? The question hung in the courtroom, and James felt the weight of 9 years pressing down on his shoulders. Every missed bedtime with Sarah, every birthday party he'd skipped to chase leads, every relationship that had withered because he couldn't let go of the hunt. All of it reduced to a defense attorney's suggestion that grief had made him delusional. I accept that my wife is dead. I've accepted it every morning for 9 years when I wake up and she's not there. What I don't accept is that her death was an accident. And what I won't accept is letting the man who ordered it walk free because admitting the truth is uncomfortable for the system that failed to protect her. The words came out harder than he'd intended, and he saw Patricia Carter wince slightly. Emotion was dangerous on the witness stand, gave the defense ammunition to paint him as unstable. But it was also the truth, raw and unfiltered, and he was tired of packaging his grief in language that made other people comfortable. Sullivan had continued the cross-examination for another hour, picking at details and timelines, trying to find inconsistencies that would undermine credibility. But James had lived with these facts for 9 years, knew them better than the defense attorney ever could. By the time Judge Wilson dismissed him, he felt wrung out but intact. Sarah had been waiting in the hallway with Catherine, and she'd run to him the moment he appeared. "You were good, Daddy. You told the truth. Truth doesn't always win in court, baby. Sometimes the better story wins instead. But you had both, truth and a good story." James had hugged her, grateful for the faith of 9-year-olds who hadn't yet learned that the world didn't always reward virtue with victory. The prosecution rested its case the following week after presenting forensic accountants who'd traced every dollar through shell companies, FBI agents who'd documented Harrison's pattern of victim framing, and victim testimony from Dorothy Williams and George Thompson that had left several jurors visibly moved. The defense case lasted 4 days and consisted primarily of character witnesses who testified that Robert Harrison was a pillar of the community, a generous donor to charity, a man who'd mentored young professionals and volunteered at homeless shelters. None of them addressed the financial evidence directly, focusing instead on the narrative that such a good man couldn't possibly be guilty of such terrible crimes. Harrison himself took the stand on the final day of the defense case, a risky move that Sullivan had probably advised against, but that Harrison's ego couldn't resist. He testified for 6 hours, calmly explaining away each piece of evidence as misinterpretation or coincidence, suggesting that the shell companies were legitimate tax structures and the victim framing was unfortunate timing, rather than deliberate action. "I've dedicated my career to building companies and creating value. The suggestion that I would destroy innocent lives for financial gain is absurd." These allegations stem from James Cooper's understandable but misguided grief. "I sympathize with his loss, but his conspiracy theory doesn't become truth just because he spent years believing it." Patricia Carter's cross-examination had been surgical, using Harrison's own words against him, highlighting the contradictions between his testimony and the documentary evidence. "Mr. Harrison, you testified that the shell companies were for legitimate tax purposes. Can you explain why $186 million ended up in your personal accounts in the Bahamas?" "Those accounts were established for retirement planning that required hiding the money from your employers and the IRS. The tax structures were complex but legal. Then why did you use Catherine Sterling's forged signature to authorize transfers instead of your own? Why create false documentation that made it appear she was embezzling if the transactions were legitimate?" Harrison had stumbled through answers that satisfied no one, and by the time Patricia finished with him, even the sympathetic jurors looked skeptical. Closing arguments happened on a Friday morning 3 weeks after the trial began. Patricia Carter had summarized the evidence with the same methodical precision she'd used throughout the trial, building from document to testimony to conclusion like a prosecutor who trusted juries to follow logic. "The defense wants you to believe that all of this is coincidence, that 8 people just happened to be framed using the identical method, that James Cooper spent 9 years fabricating evidence because he couldn't accept his wife's accidental death, that David Anderson came forward with photographs and text messages that perfectly corroborate a false narrative, that the server logs showing Robert Harrison accessing Catherine Sterling's credentials at 2 in the morning were somehow legitimate corporate business. But coincidence has limits. At some point, the pattern becomes proof. The evidence proves that Robert Harrison is a thief, a fraud, and a man who ordered murder to protect his crimes. Your job is to hold him accountable for all of it." Sullivan's closing had leaned heavily on reasonable doubt, painting the prosecution's case as circumstantial and driven by James's obsession. "The prosecution has given you a compelling narrative, but a compelling narrative is not the same as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Yes, Mr. Harrison used shell companies, but that's not illegal. Yes, the timing of Margaret Cooper's death was suspicious, but suspicion is not proof. Yes, James Cooper gathered evidence, but he gathered it through deception and illegal surveillance. methods that taint everything he touched. You are the last barrier between an innocent man and wrongful conviction. The prosecution is asking you to believe their theory despite the holes in their evidence. I'm asking you to demand actual proof, not just coincidence and innuendo. That's what reasonable doubt means. That's what justice requires. The jury had deliberated for 4 days, and each day that passed felt like a year. James had tried to maintain normal routines with Sarah, making breakfast and helping with homework and pretending that his entire world wasn't hanging on the decision of 12 strangers. But the waiting carved out pieces of him, left him hollow and anxious in ways that 9 years of hunting had never achieved. Catherine had called every evening, checking in with the kind of concern that came from shared trauma. They'd been through different versions of the same crisis, and the bond that created was strange and necessary. "How are you holding up?" "Terrified that we came this close and it still won't be enough." "It's enough, James. Even if the jury doesn't convict on murder, the fraud charges are ironclad. He's going to prison. But not for killing Margaret. That's what matters." "Is it? Or does it matter more that you exposed him, saved 8 people from carrying his crimes, and built a case that even a defense attorney with unlimited resources couldn't fully discredit?" James had thought about that question long into the night, trying to separate what he needed from what qualified as justice. The distinction remained elusive. The verdict came on a Tuesday afternoon, the jury filing back into the courtroom with expressions that gave nothing away. Judge Wilson had asked for the verdict forms, and the foreperson, a woman in her 50s who'd taken careful notes throughout the trial, had handed them over with steady hands. "On count 1, wire fraud, how do you find?" "Guilty." "Count 2, money laundering, how do you find?" "Guilty." The guilty verdicts kept coming, 27 in a row for the financial crimes, each one landing with the weight of validation. James had felt Sarah's hand in his, squeezing tight enough to hurt, and realized his daughter was crying silently, tears of relief streaming down her face. Then came count 28, conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Margaret Cooper. "How do you find?" The pause before the answer felt eternal, time stretching and compressing until the present moment existed outside normal causality. "Guilty." The courtroom had erupted in ways that Judge Wilson immediately shut down. But for 10 seconds there was chaos, Catherine crying and Helen Rodriguez in the gallery shouting something in Spanish and reporters scrambling for the exits to file stories. Through it all, James had sat perfectly still, the word echoing in his head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Guilty. For Margaret. For 9 years of waiting. For every morning Sarah had woken up without her mother. Guilty. Harrison had stood for the reading, and James had watched him receive each verdict with the same controlled expression he'd used in the boardroom 9 months ago. But when the murder conspiracy verdict came, something broke in his face, a crack that let through whatever he'd been holding back. He'd turned to look at James, and their eyes had met one final time. Harrison's expression held rage and defeat, and something that might have been the first honest emotion James had ever seen from him. Then the marshals were leading him away, and James was standing because his legs had decided to work again, and Sarah was hugging him with the fierce strength of someone who'd needed this ending, even if she couldn't fully understand what it meant. Patricia Carter had approached them in the hallway afterward, professional satisfaction mixing with genuine relief. "We did it. 28 convictions, including murder conspiracy. Sentencing is in 6 weeks, but with the federal guidelines, he's looking at minimum 25 years, probably closer to 30 with the murder charge. At 58, that's effectively life. Thank you for believing the evidence enough to bring the case. I didn't just believe the evidence. I believed you. And I believed that Margaret Cooper deserved better than an investigation that closed before it really began." The media coverage had been immediate and overwhelming. James's face on every news channel, the story framed as vindication for the grieving husband who'd spent 9 years hunting his wife's killer. Publishers had called offering book deals, documentary producers wanting exclusive rights, speaking agents promising 6-figure lecture circuits. James had ignored all of it, focusing instead on the victim advocacy work that Catherine's foundation had finally convinced him to direct. The Thompson Cooper Justice Fund had resources to help people like Dorothy Williams and George Thompson, wrongfully convicted individuals who needed forensic accounting and legal support to prove their innocence. It was meaningful work, and it let James use the expertise he'd built during 9 years of hunting without requiring the obsessive single-mindedness that had defined that hunt. Harrison's sentencing happened in August, a hot Tuesday when the courthouse air conditioning fought a losing battle against humidity that made everyone's clothes stick. Judge Wilson had listened to victim impact statements from Dorothy Williams, George Thompson, Mary Garcia, and finally James, each one detailing the years stolen and lives destroyed by one man's greed. When it was James's turn, he'd stood with the same notes he'd prepared but found he couldn't read them. Instead, he'd looked at Harrison and spoken from memory that had been carved too deep to need reference materials. Margaret Cooper was the most remarkable person I've ever known. She was brilliant and funny and believed that the law should protect people instead of institutions. When she died, I lost my wife and Sarah lost her mother and the world lost someone who was making it incrementally better through dedication and careful work. You took all of that for $3.2 million, for money you didn't even need because you already had wealth most people can't imagine. You took it because you could, because the system let you. Because people like Margaret were inconvenient obstacles to your comfort. I don't expect you to care about the harm you've caused. 9 years of watching you operate taught me that you're incapable of genuine remorse. But I want you to know that Margaret won anyway. The case she was building might have been buried, but the truth survived because she documented it thoroughly enough that even you couldn't destroy all the evidence. She beat you from beyond the grave, and that's justice in a way that this sentencing can't fully capture. Judge Wilson had sentenced Harrison to 28 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before 24 years served. At 58, he'd be 82 if he lived long enough to see freedom again. The sentence felt simultaneously insufficient and exactly proportionate, a number that couldn't restore what had been taken but could at least prevent future harm. Afterward, James had taken Sarah to Coney Island, a celebration that she'd requested because normal 9-year-olds celebrated victories with cotton candy and roller coasters instead of solemn reflection. They'd ridden the Cyclone 3 times despite James's fear of heights, eaten hot dogs that dripped mustard onto shirts they'd designated as sacrificial, and walked along the boardwalk as evening turned the ocean purple and gold. "Daddy, are you happy now?" Sarah had asked it while they sat on a bench watching waves roll in, the question delivered with the casual directness that children wielded like scalpels. "I'm something close to it. Not quite happy, but not angry anymore either. Maybe that's the best I get. Mom would want you to be actually happy." "How do you know? You don't remember her." "I remember the stories you tell, and someone who sang Stevie Wonder off-key and made terrible food and believed in justice. She wouldn't want you sad forever." James had pulled his daughter close, breathing in the salt air and sunscreen smell of summer, understanding that children sometimes possessed wisdom that adults had forgotten how to access. "You're right. She'd want me to be present instead of haunted, so that's what I'm going to try to be." The year after the sentencing, James settled into a rhythm he'd never thought possible. Director of the Thompson Cooper Justice Fund 20 hours a week, home by 3 to help Sarah with homework, present for every science fair and parent-teacher conference he'd missed during the hunt. Catherine had become a steady presence in their lives, not romantic but something more durable than friendship. A partnership built on shared trauma and mutual respect. Sarah thrived. Science club, sleepovers with friends, the gap-toothed smile appearing more frequently as her father's distraction faded into reliability. Richard Jr. had transferred to a private school across the city after his father's arrest, sparing her the awkwardness of sharing classrooms with the son of the man who'd killed her mother. 2 years after the verdict, the Thompson Cooper Justice Fund had helped exonerate 17 wrongfully convicted individuals. recovered $43 million in fraudulent transactions from various corporate schemes, and established a legal clinic at Howard University dedicated to financial crime investigation. The work had grown beyond anything James had imagined when Catherine first proposed the idea, becoming a genuine force for systemic change instead of just individual case resolution. James had hired a staff of 6, splitting his time between forensic investigation and administration. Finding that he was better at the latter than he'd expected, the work felt connected to Margaret's legacy without being consumed by it, honoring her memory through action instead of obsession. Sarah had started 8th grade with plans to attend science camp the following summer, her interest in physics and astronomy growing stronger each year. She'd asked James if he thought her mother would have been proud, and he'd told her the truth. Margaret would have been overwhelmed with pride at the young woman Sarah was becoming. She would have helped with your science projects and made terrible snacks and asked you a million questions about quantum mechanics that she didn't really understand, but wanted to hear you explain anyway. Do you still miss her? Every day. But it doesn't hurt like it used to. Now it's more like background noise, always there but not drowning out everything else. On the 3rd anniversary of the verdict, James had received a letter from Robert Harrison. The prison return address had made him consider throwing it away unopened, but curiosity won over caution. Inside, 2 pages of handwriting that had deteriorated from the precise script James remembered. Mr. Cooper, I write this not expecting forgiveness or even acknowledgement, but because 3 years in federal prison have given me time to think about accountability in ways my previous life never required. You were right about almost everything. The fraud, the framing, the systematic destruction of innocent lives to protect my own comfort. I did all of it with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never having to face consequences. But I want you to know that I did not order your wife's death. I hired Andrew Mitchell to frighten her, to make her back off the investigation. The brake tampering was supposed to be minor, enough to create car trouble and fear, but not to kill. When I learned she'd died, I was horrified. Not horrified enough to turn myself in, clearly, but genuinely devastated by the outcome. This distinction probably doesn't matter to you. Dead is dead regardless of intent, but I've spent 3 years living with the knowledge that I'm responsible for a death I didn't want, and I thought you should know that whatever else I am, I'm not quite the monster you imagine. I don't expect this to change anything. You won, I lost, and the verdict was largely just even if the murder conspiracy charge rested on a misunderstanding of my actual intent. But I wanted you to have the full truth, such as it is, from someone who finally has no reason left to lie. I hope you found peace. I hope your daughter is thriving. And I hope that someday when you think about me, it's with the understanding that people are more complicated than the worst things they do. James had read the letter 3 times, trying to decide if it changed anything. The distinction between ordering murder and ordering intimidation that resulted in murder felt academic from where Margaret was concerned. Dead was dead, as Harrison had acknowledged. He filed the letter in a box with other trial documents. Evidence of a journey that had consumed 9 years and concluded with something messier than closure but more honest than revenge. He didn't write back. Sarah had graduated 8th grade at the top of her class, accepted into a specialized science high school that would prepare her for the kind of career Margaret had always dreamed she might pursue. At the graduation ceremony, James had sat next to Catherine and Helen, watching his daughter cross the stage to receive an award for academic excellence and thinking about all the moments Margaret had missed and all the moments that remained to be lived. That night, Sarah had asked if they could visit Margaret's grave, a request she made occasionally but never predictably. They'd driven to the cemetery in Queens where Margaret was buried next to her grandmother, the two of them keeping each other company in death as they had in life. Sarah had brought flowers, yellow roses, because James had told her those were Margaret's favorite. She'd placed them carefully, then sat cross-legged on the grass with the kind of easy comfort that came from growing up with death as a fact rather than a trauma. "Mom, I got into the science program. Dad says you would have been proud, but I wanted to tell you myself. I'm going to study physics and maybe astronomy, and I'm going to be the kind of person who asks questions even when the answers are complicated, just like you." James had stood back, giving his daughter privacy for the conversation, understanding that Sarah's relationship with Margaret's memory belonged to her as much as to him. When she finished, she'd stood and hugged him with the particular fierceness of teenagers who were learning to navigate the gap between childhood and whatever came next. "Daddy, I think we're going to be okay." "Yeah, baby, I think we are." They'd driven home through evening traffic, the radio playing old Stevie Wonder songs that Margaret used to sing, and James had let himself feel something that approximated happiness. Not the uncomplicated joy of people who'd never lost anything significant, but the hard-won contentment of someone who'd survived grief without becoming defined by it. The brownstone lights were on when they arrived, warm and welcoming in a way that hadn't always been true. James had learned to see his home as more than the headquarters of a hunt, and the difference that made was subtle but transformative. Inside, Sarah had gone to her room to text friends about graduation plans, and James had stood in the kitchen, where he'd planned Harrison's downfall, looking at Margaret's photo on the mantel. He'd lit the candle he still lit every morning, watched the flames settle into steady burning. "We did it, Margaret. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter. Sarah's thriving. The work continues, and I'm learning to be present instead of haunted. It's not the life we planned, but it's a good life anyway. I think you'd approve." The photo didn't answer, but in the candlelight, Margaret's smile looked like permission to keep living instead of just surviving, to build a future that honored her memory without being imprisoned by it. James blew out the candle and went to help Sarah plan her summer, ready for whatever came next, choosing presence over absence, choosing joy when justice had finally, imperfectly, been served.